Good afternoon, everybody. I apologize for the mix-up. I know that a lot of you were told that I'd be in the city room, and so I don't know how that happened, but I thought I was going to be there too, and I went over to the desk and asked them, because I saw that I was scheduled for this class and the other, so she said I'm set for this class, not the city room. So here we are. So I'm really looking forward to this series. I've been studying up for all of these great women leaders. There's a lot of interesting things that you come across, and we'll see as we go. But the first, we have Hatshepsut. Can everybody say Hatshepsut?
Hatshepsut.
It takes some practice. Think of a hat. Start with that, and the rest of it kind of comes along. Hatshepsut. When I told my son that I was teaching on Hatshepsut, he said Gesundheit. Real chip off the old block. So anyway, this first woman leader, the ancient Egyptians. This is a very new thing for me. I'm used to reading history on a lot of different eras, but not ancient Egypt. For me, when I read a history, I like to learn about the person and events that are happening with some assurance that what I'm reading has actually happened. That's not always the case with ancient Egypt. I think it must be terribly frustrating to be an Egyptologist, because in the books that I have read, there are a wide variety of facts that people are certain of that contradict the facts of other people. So, yeah, this is very frustrating. So anyway, we'll get into the bibliography. The first one I really like. There's this whole series, and they don't even tell you the author. In 60 Learning. So it's supposedly in 60 minutes you can learn a whole lot about some character. And this is one on Hatshepsut. And it's very good. It's 44 pages, and so it's a quick read. You get a good overview of the latest in Egyptology with regard to Hatshepsut. The next one, Joyce Tildesley, the female pharaoh. This one I enjoyed because it was very informative. I did not enjoy it as a light summer reading. It's rather dry, but it is very informative, and the scholarship up to that time is very good. The next one, Evelyn Wells' Hatshepsut from 1969, is a very good read if you don't know anything about Hatshepsut. If you do know a lot about Hatshepsut, you'll know that her scholarship is either way out of date or just sloppy. There's a lot of things that she says about Hatshepsut, and this was the first book that I read too. And so I'm learning all these things about Hatshepsut, and then I read the Joyce Tildesley book and find out that half of it is wrong because of new scholarship, or she's just a better scholar. This last one, Kara Cooney, When Women Ruled the World, this is on several Egyptian women leaders, Hatshepsut being just one of them. This one, the chapter on Hatshepsut, I enjoyed the most, and I disliked the most as well. She's a very entertaining writer, and scholarly as well. But she has a kind of a chip on her shoulder, I think. And this is a very recent 2018. And it was a bit disheartening to me because she gets very political in her writing. And so in reading about the ancient Egyptian Pharaoh Hatshepsut, I also have to read about George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Donald Trump. And so I'm thinking, good Lord, if I can't escape Donald Trump by reading ancient Egyptian writings, where are we safe? So, and also, I have no interest in knowing what Hatshepsut would think of Hillary Clinton either. But aside from that, she's actually very good. So, to have an overview of ancient Egypt, it's a pretty, again, Egypt is just a vast territory of history and archaeology, thousands of years, that makes U.S. history look puny by comparison. And so just to get a grip on the events of these thousands of years is a real chore in and of itself. But we'll start with the three major kingdoms of ancient Egypt. Of course, it was first farmed about 10,000 years ago when farming first came into the world. It was originally in Mesopotamia, but it came to the Nile Delta area not long afterwards. We start with the first dynasty in the Old Kingdom, about 3100 BC, when they unified Upper and Lower Egypt along the Nile. Then we have the pyramids that were built round about 2550 BC. And there we have the pyramids. Everybody knows about them. And for me, it's just so mind-boggling because I think about the United States. We talk about 300 or 400 years, and Egypt, 1,000 years goes by, and another 1,000 years goes by, and the multitudes of events and people who have lived and died and struggled and lived their lives. It's just, for me, it's just mind-boggling. Then we have the first intermediate period where society breaks down. The upper and lower Nile are separated. A lot of chaotic events from 23 to 21, a couple of hundred years. What's a couple hundred years, huh? And then we have the Middle Kingdom, where Egypt is united again, 2100 to 1650 BC, where they expand their empire somewhat to the south and to the east. And then we have the second intermediate period, where we have the Hyksos invasion. Some people from the east come, and here's another thing where we're not really sure if they were an invading army or they were just people who migrated gradually and eventually just took over because there were so many of them. But anyway, there's the Hyksos invasion, and they ruled Lower Egypt for some time and kept the upper part of Egypt somewhat as a vassal state. On the plus side, they introduced things to Egypt that was unknown until then. Bronze. This is the Bronze Age, and Egypt now has bronze, weapons and tools. Horses are new to Egypt at this time also. And since horses are too small to ride, you have chariots. At this time, you did not have Clydesdales. You had fairly small horses that I suppose you could ride them, more like a Shetland pony maybe, but they were not big enough to use as riding horses into war. So you had chariots to do that. And so chariots was a new thing also. And here is a representation of the Hyksos. And then we come to the New Kingdom. Eventually, after 100 years or so, King Thutmose I conquers the Hyksos. And this was not just a one-time battle and it's over with. This was over really many years of fighting back and forth and many, many battles in which the Hyksos gradually gave up their power and were defeated. So King Thutmose I was founder of the 18th dynasty, around about 1550. He reigned for 25 years, and possibly for the first time, and here's another thing that's very frustrating, women in Egyptian society. How much power were they ever, did they ever enjoy before Hatshepsut? Well, it depends on who you're reading. One book will tell you that Hatshepsut was the first woman pharaoh. Another will tell you she was the second. Another the third. And someone else will tell you she was the fourth. So anyway, but we do know that women were given power in ancient Egypt, as opposed to many other civilizations at that time. It was rather unusual for women to get power and to share power with their husbands. And one of the technicalities about whether you are considered a ruler or not is that sometimes the women, when their husbands died and their children are young, would become the regent of the child who would be the next pharaoh. If the kid is 5 years old, you can't expect him to be to take on the responsibilities of a pharaoh, and so the mother could be the regent. And so that's how a number of women came to power in Egypt. And this representation of Thutmose I and Nefertari, his wife, is significant because in many depictions of pharaohs with their wives, you have the pharaoh and his wife, okay? The wife is very small next to, if she exists at all in the pictures. You have the pharaoh very large, the wife very small next to her, and that tells you a lot. In this depiction, you have the husband and wife, the pharaoh and his wife, as appearing to be equal, at least in size and in grandeur. Then we come to Amenhotep I, reigned for 21 years, quite possibly dominated by his mother Nefertari, married to Meritanum, and had no children, at least none that lived to adulthood. And so, because of that, he had to choose a successor, and he chose someone, again, in dispute, who probably was a general under him who served, Thutmose I.
But a question.
Yes?
Would you go back to the previous slide? He's black and she's white. Does that mean
That's a pretty curious thing, isn't it?
Does that mean he's from Upper Egypt and she was lower?
No. Honestly, I'm not sure what that means. I know that for some people, they will take that to mean that sub-Saharan African people were also, pharaohs, and that, the pharaohs themselves were black. It doesn't mean that at all. But honestly, I don't know what that means. Yes?
We were told in Egypt that white indicated females and dark was male.
So she said that black indicated male and lighter skin was female.
Females didn't get outside where
Yeah. I haven't heard that. So this will be a first for me. Yeah. So, for those of you who are really sharp spellers, you'll know that I have spelled Thutmose I in different ways, because depending on who you read, it is spelled differently. So anyway, it could be T-H-U-T, it could be T-U-T-H. But however it is, this is the guy. Thutmose I ruled from approximately 1506 to 1493 BC. He had, from his royal wife, and as we know, there is the royal wife, and then there are the other wives, and then there are the concubines, which make up the harem. So there's no lack of children from the pharaoh usually, but the children that would grow up to be the successors are supposed to be from the royal queen and not from the other wives or concubines. There are exceptions, but that's kind of a general rule.
So what's the difference between these wives and the concubines?
Just a matter of status, I suppose. So a wife would be more honored than a concubine. A concubine is probably a woman captured in battle from your enemies, or a slave that you bought, would be my guess. So Hatshepsut was the only surviving child from the royal wife, Amos. He had, I believe she had an older sister and 2 younger brothers, and they all died in their youth. So you have Hatshepsut. Now, since there are other children from the wives and concubines, to have a successor, you would have to have a boy from hopefully one of the wives to marry Hatshepsut. Therefore, you could have a royal line that would continue. Now, the fact that they would be half brother, half sister, was not a problem at all to the Egyptians. They didn't have any difficulty with a full brother and sister marrying and having children either. So that's how you keep the royal blood clean. But so anyway, so during the reign of Thutmose I, he was known as a great warrior, conquered many people surrounding him, both in the south and towards the east. You have the Palestine area and Syria, and you have the Nubian kingdom to the south, and that's what he had conquered. And by the time he had died, he had a fairly stable empire. So, and the other thing that he was really into was rebuilding things. The Karnak temple was actually a complex of shrines and temples that he improved upon because it had fallen into disrepair over the Hyksos interim. He went on a great building program and built many shrines and temples in the Karnak complex. And here's Thutmose I. Again, he's black. Now, I'll have to look into that. I've never heard that the men are depicted as black. Yes?
Do you know that ancient Egyptians there was no civilization that grew up in Egypt. It all started somewhere 55,000 years ago in where Nigeria is now. And then the rain stopped. So they started to migrate from there looking for water. And that's why they're all dark.
Yeah, that's going past my time, so but thank you for the comment. I appreciate it. So anyway, so here's Thutmose I, and here is the Egyptian empire that he left upon his passing. You have the central area, Thebes, is where a lot of the temples and things were. Down here in the south, you have the Nubian kingdoms that were conquered. And of course, we have Palestine, Syria over here. And notice down here they have Punt. We will get to that in a little while, but that will be significant. And we have the Karnak Temple Complex, which you can visit. Anybody been to Egypt? Wow, that's great. Have you been here, Karnak Temple? Sure. All right. Pretty amazing stuff. But yeah, a lot of the temple, as I said, had been in great disrepair, and it was Thutmose I who began rebuilding a lot of it, and subsequent pharaohs also built upon that. So now we come to Hatshepsut. She was born maybe in 1507 BC. She was raised as a pampered royal, of course, as much pampering as you can get in those days. She was given an education, taught to read and write, learned the elaborate rituals of court etiquette, and she could also go hunting, she would go fishing, and she played with boomerangs. As we know, or should know, boomerangs are not just in Australia. There were many early cultures who developed various types of things that we would call a boomerang, both as hunting weapons and as the toy that you would throw and come back to you. And as I said, her older sister and younger brothers died when they were young. And here are some examples of Egyptian boomerangs from ancient Egypt. I hear that King Tut had a whole collection of them that was found in his tomb. So, to find a suitable husband for Hatshepsut, you need go no farther than the royal harem, and you have one of his wives, variously called either Isit or Isis, had a son that became Thutmose II. And anyway, so Hatshepsut is then married to her half-brother, and she bore one child, her daughter, and this one bothers me to no end, how to pronounce this, Nefrurur. But anyway, as it turns out, Thutmose II was a fairly weak physical specimen. He reigned, depending on who you're looking at, he reigned for either 2 to 7 years, and then he died without accomplishing very much at all. He may have gone on a campaign to quell some uprising somewhere in the kingdom once, but not a lot happened while he was Pharaoh. And so Thutmose dies, 1493. Thutmose II, his son, rules for a few years. And again, you'll notice that sometimes what I tell you and then the years might look a little different. It's because I'm pretty mixed up with all the different information that I've gotten. So if you see inconsistencies, just know that it isn't my fault. Okay? It just depends on who you're looking at. Okay, so as I say, no significant accomplishments from Thutmose II. And so Hatshepsut, when the father dies, becomes the regent to Thutmose III. And during this time, for the first few years, she is known as the regent, but gradually, probably a period of about 7 years or so, and by the way, Thutmose III, probably a very young kid, maybe 5 to 10 years old, roughly speaking, but certainly too young to reign on his own, so he needed a regent. And so Hatshepsut, even though she was not the mother of Thutmose III, she became the regent. She had connections, and here's another one. She was somewhere between the age of 15 and 30. So yeah, huge difference. But in any case, she had connections. However old she was, she had very good connections. Nobody rules on their own. You have to have good connections with the priests, the military, the bureaucracy, somewhere along the lines. And most scholars will tell you she was probably on the young side of that scale, 15 to 30. So she obviously had good connections. And she also obviously showed real talent as a leader. And so within a fairly short period of time, as taking power as regent, she started taking charge. She very quickly got the title or the name of Ma'at Kara, which is it's kind of a spiritual embodiment of kingship, the throne name. And I guess, so the definition or the meaning of this is something like the soul of Ra is truth.
Question?
Yes?
I hate to be obtuse. So Thutmose III was some issue of Thutmose II in some
Yes.
right, but not Hatshepsut.
Yes, that is correct. Thank you for clarifying that.
I lost
Yeah.
the lineage.
I tell you, I lose it all the time.
Okay.
Trying to keep straight that that she is both the stepmother and the aunt of Thutmose III. So thank you for clarifying. Okay, so as I say, she very early on, in the first few years of her regency, started taking on the trappings of the Pharaoh, the kingship, taking charge of the government. And so she was, again, somewhere between 2 to 7 years. I think they usually say it's more like 7 years. She eventually became the crowned king or pharaoh, and thereafter is depicted usually as a man, because a pharaoh, there was no term for a queen. There is the Pharaoh, which in our eyes, it sounds like, you could be the president and it doesn't matter whether you're man or woman, you're still president. If you're a king, you're a king. If you're a queen, you're a queen, right? So, but a Pharaoh doesn't designate the sex of the person who owns that title. But if you are the Pharaoh, you were expected to be a man. And so she took on the clothing and was often referred to, she would refer to herself in the male as a male, and calling herself he and him. Now, why would she do that? First of all, she's not trying to fool anybody. She's not trying to tell the kingdom that she is now a man, or that she suddenly somebody suddenly appeared and is now the Pharaoh who is a man. And I haven't really heard a very good explanation for this, but I'm assuming it is basically they needed the image of a man because that's what they're used to. And so she could take on the trappings, she could take on the titles of a man, because in their beliefs, their gods frequently could change into many different things. So in a sense, spiritually, she would present herself as a man, and that could be accepted. So anyway, in any case, as I say, most of the time when she is referred to, when she's written about, she's referred to as a he, but not always. Don't ask me why. It's one of those odd things.
She had a beard in that picture.
Right. And then she would wear, on ceremonial occasions, she would wear a fake beard that would be strapped to her chin. But I'm kind of wondering if the men didn't do the same. Just to have that perfect beard, they would have a strapped-on beard too. It would just look a little more strange with her. So here's Hatshepsut, who took on the trappings of a man. Now, once she did that, she needs to convince everybody that this is the right thing to do. You have now a woman pharaoh. And as I said before, depending on who you're reading, she was either the first, second, third, or fourth woman to take on the title of pharaoh. She did it. She was probably the first one to do so outwardly, so boldly. And certainly none up until her time had reigned as long. She was in power for about 20 years. So, in order to convince everybody that she's doing the right thing, she creates her whole life as a myth. And so, on the walls of the buildings that she would be constructing, she creates the myth of her divine birth from the god Amun. And so she is a god, the male god, who is now Pharaoh. And pharaohs are supposed to be gods. So the royal Ka created this personification of kingship. And on the temple walls, Hatshepsut is born as a boy. And this same story is presented a number of times in various shrines about that she had built. And it's interesting, some of the quotes that she supposedly would state, at least quotes that are attributed to her on the walls, "He who will praise her will live. He who will speak an evil thing, ignoring her majesty, he will die." Probably not unlike any other pharaoh would make a statement, but they make very strong statements like that. So, Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, they were co-rulers during her entire reign. She was officially the regent at first. She became pharaoh, but he was also in charge as well. And one of the rare instances in history where you have co-rulers who actually get along. It's very rare. This type of thing where the mother is the regent and the child grows up, almost invariably, the child grows up and deposes and often kills the mother. Or, if you have a very strong mother, she either will kill her own child or keeps him under wraps in some way. But you almost never have two people as co-rulers and get along. In this case, they did. They were often presented on the walls of various shrines as equals, and there is no evidence in the historical record that either of them resented the other. Very rare. And as I say, they obviously had the support of the priests, the military, and the bureaucracy. They were very happy with Hatshepsut. The people enjoyed her reign. She presented herself very well. We know this because there were very few rebellions during her time as pharaoh. There's always some, and there were a couple during her reign that needed to be put down, but her reign was generally a very peaceful one. So here is Hatshepsut and Thutmose III presented.
Which is which?
Good question. I believe this is Hatshepsut. She is in the lead from Thutmose.
Is that a boomerang she's holding?
No,
Oh,
it's straight. I'm not sure what that is.
well, in the pictures of the boomerang, there was one that looked like that.
I think it looks too straight to me, though.
Yeah. It looks like a stick.
It's like she's gonna hammer his head.
Yeah.
So, after 15 years of ruling, she held a jubilee. Normally, you're supposed to have a jubilee after 30 years, but in this case, it was not unheard of to have one at 15, so it wasn't a novel thing. But anytime you want to prop up your regime, you hold a celebration, and this is something that she was very good at. During her jubilee, she was big ceremonies to the gods. She was offering her sacrifices of water and milk to Amun, the chief of the gods. And Hatshepsut is ahead of Thutmose III, but still fairly equal. And he's about 18 years old at that time. And one of the more interesting things, she is presented as suckling from the god Hathor. This is not an unusual thing. There are many depictions of the god Hathor, who could be many different animals, by the way, but is often depicted as a cow. But the pharaohs suckling from this god Hathor are making a statement that I'm getting nourishment, I'm being supported by this god. And Hatshepsut followed suit. One of the most thrilling things during her reign was an expedition to Punt. And I'd mentioned that on the map earlier. The southern part of the Red Sea had not been reached in generations. They knew that there were marvelous treasures there. And so she sent this expedition to find the land of Punt and open trade relations with them once again. And they sent 5 ships, and they brought back 5 ships loaded with treasures that they hadn't seen in a long time. Silver and gold, ebony, ivory, frankincense, 30 myrrh trees. Probably the most valuable of the bunch were the myrrh trees, myrrh being a fragrance that was highly valued at the time. They brought back some cattle, lapis lazuli, malachite, and some dancing pygmies, which was a real novelty, and a baboon, hopefully a trained baboon, but that was a real novelty for them.
Just one baboon?
I think that they mentioned a baboon. Could have been more. And so this is depicted on the walls. Here is the myrrh trees they brought back and planted so that they could have their own myrrh. I believe they get it from the sap of the tree. Yes?
What is Punt today? What country?
I believe it's just north of I believe it's Etruria. Somalia is just south of it. So it's just north of Somalia. And I believe it's Etruria. Eritrea, thank you. And they found the queen of Punt to be a very odd-looking specimen. So they, whoever saw her thought it might be a good thing to put her on the wall too, because she was such a interesting-looking woman. And so this is the queen of Punt.
Looks like she's deformed.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Maybe from intermarriage.
Who knows?
Wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. The other thing that Hatshepsut was famous for, she followed in the footsteps of her father and embarked on a great building program, even greater than her father's. Again, she restored many temples and monuments. One that I thought was particularly interesting was the god Pakhet, she who scratches, is a lion god. And I'll show you a picture in a second. The Greeks equated Pakhet with Artemis. But of course, another way of building herself up and promoting her reign is to build great monuments. And this is something that she could do because her father had settled a lot of disputes with the neighbors, and they were very prosperous at this time. She came along, and since she was not a warlike, conquering sort of pharaoh, she was going to build, and they had the prosperity to do it. So here is the lion-headed Pakhet. Yes?
I think that she never had a child, but had she had one, what status would it have had?
She did have a daughter.
She did have a daughter.
She had a daughter, yes. We don't know ultimately what became of the daughter. And I'll get to that later, but yeah, she did have a daughter. She also had built some obelisks. Her father set up two obelisks at the entrance of Karnak. They were about 64 feet tall. Hatshepsut's obelisks, she had 4 of them erected. They were about 100 feet tall, so she wants to outdo her father. There was a 5th obelisk that was in the process of being made in her reign that was going to be almost 140 feet tall. During its construction, it was broken, and so they couldn't get that one all the way. They had originally gold leaf at the point of these obelisks, and of course, as we know, the obelisks are meant to display the grandeur and the honors of the rulers at the time. There's only one of her obelisks now that's left. The others have been either carted away or just fallen, knocked over. And here is the unfinished one, still in the quarry. Would be almost 140 feet tall. How they would move that thing is beyond me. And then the greatest monument to Hatshepsut that she had built was Djesertu. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Her mortuary temple, which again was a series of shrines, would be inside. The words Djesertu means Holy of Holies, the most holy sites that she was building for herself as a mortuary, set against cliffs in white limestone on the west side of the Nile, opposite from Karnak. And it was a multifunctional temple complex of shrines to various gods. And how many of you have been there? Pretty magnificent, I take it. Did you? Wow. Yes.
It was carved out of the mountain, by the way.
Yes. Yes. As you can see, it's carved right into the mountain, carved out of the mountain, and quite unique. Many people have looked at this thinking that it's very much like a Greek temple, despite the fact that it's a good 1,000 years before the Greeks. So on the walls of Djesertu, they tell the story of Hatshepsut and the glories of her reign, and the various things that she would enjoy: hunting, fishing, shooting arrows. She is depicted as a sphinx trampling the enemies of Egypt, and it tells of her divine birth and coronation and the expedition to Punt. Here's some of the.
Egypt great again.
What's that?
Does that mean she made Egypt great
Yes, she
again?
did. She made Egypt great again. She probably even had a hat that said that. Here's some more of the walls of Djesertu.
I'm curious as to how they went from hieroglyphics to having some written language that you're displaying there that means Holy of Holies.
That's a bit beyond my pay grade. Yeah, it's the history of Egypt is a world unto itself, and there's so much there that I'm just dipping my toes into it, and it's very fascinating. But there's just a lot to it. Yes.
Glyphics doesn't have an alphabet. Each character is a word by itself. And one word that I know is like a sword. That means the sea. And that's why later on people who wanted to teach it to people transcribed it to Greek alphabet, alpha, beta, gamma, and they added another 6 or 8 characters so that they cover all the sounds.
Yeah, very nice. And that's from the Rosetta Stone, right? Where they actually learned how to read hieroglyphics. Yeah. But yeah, as you can see, there are large pictures, small pictures, and then the kind of the pictographs of the Egyptian language. And she also, as many pharaohs did, had many, many statues of herself made. It's hard to say how many, but it could be well over 100 that she would place around the shrines. She would line paths with her statues. And it was said that the earlier ones make her look very feminine. The older ones, or the later ones, she looked much more like a man. And she's often portrayed as a sphinx, which was a popular pose in which Pharaoh would present themselves. Most of them were destroyed much later. We still have some very good ones in various museums, and I will show you right here. Gives you a sense of the proportion of how large some of these statues were. Here she is presenting a couple of jars in some religious ceremony to the gods. And this one again, she has a couple of jars, and then this one must be from an earlier presentation of her where she's very trim and youthful looking. And I believe it's the one that I have on the front there on your handout.
You mentioned the biblical story. Was she born to be God of a lion, or did she have a connection to a lion?
Well, that's the great thing about being a god, is that you can be just about anything you want to be. One of the things, yes, she would be depicted as a lion, the Sphinx, but we don't need to limit her there. Anyway, so here's the young, trim Hatshepsut. Here's Hatshepsut as the Sphinx. And when she wants to really look like a lion, we have Hatshepsut as the lion, lioness, or maybe just lion. So there are a number of grand statements that are left to us that she would make, or she had carved into the walls. And this one I like especially. I call it Hatshepsut's mission statement. I am the beneficent king, lawgiver, who judges deeds. I am the wild horned bull coming from heaven, that he might see her form. I am the falcon who glides over the lands, landing and dividing his borders. I am the jackal who swiftly circles the land in an instant. I am excellent of heart, one who glorifies her father, attentive to the deeds to render justice to him. Great grand statement. Very bold. And you notice she talks about her father. In a number of places she talks about her father as because he was a popular guy, and it's great to look back in a nostalgic sort of way as the great conqueror that we could all be proud of. She did not talk about her husband. He was weak, and that's not something you want to celebrate. So every year, they would celebrate the Feast of the Valley. It was celebrated at the new moon in the second month of summer. And this is where you take the god Holman on the east side of the Nile, cross over from Karnak to Jissaru, and spend the night with Hathor. And this was a great grand procession of many people on parade, as it were, bringing this god over, and the priests would give food, would wash the god and dress him up, And there would be priests, musicians, dancers, acrobats, incense bearers, and a whole host of people in this grand celebration, the Feast of the Valley. And here we have Amen in this statue. He's a ram. And then we have Hathor, who has the ears somewhat of a cow. But as I said, you need not limit the gods to one being, to one animal. And we come to her chief advisor, Senenmut. The two of them were most likely very, very close. He was a very able administrator. It had been suggested by some that he was the real power behind the throne. Again, it's impossible to say for sure how much power he had, but he was certainly a very talented man. He was given many different offices, and he was in charge of the building programs and in many other things. He was given a whole host of titles, many of which were just ceremonial. They would pile on titles to various officials just for the sake of honoring them. Many of them had no real purpose beyond just padding your resume, as it were. But he was the overseer of all the royal works, the granaries, the storehouses, the fields, gardens. He's a controller of the Hall of Amen, and he may have been an architect in charge of this building program, although he never called himself the architect. So he may not have been the designer of the various buildings that were built, but he was most likely in charge of the whole thing above the architects. And significantly, he was the steward of Hatshepsut's daughter. He, in many statues, he is depicted holding her. And so the two of them were probably very close. He came from kind of the middle upper class of Egypt, if you can think of Egypt as having a middle upper class. We don't know that he ever married, which is kind of unusual. In his tomb complex, and he constructed his own complex of tombs in which he would place himself ultimately and his family. He had his whole family together entombed, and we're reasonably sure that we know his mummy, what his mummy looks like, and pictures of him. So here is, we know that this is a statue of Senenmut with the daughter of Hatshepsut. We believe that this is his mummy because he is often depicted as having jowls and creases in his cheeks. And so this, they take as evidence that this may be him. Now the next slide I'm going to show you is a bit R-rated because Senenmut and Hatshepsut were often rumored to be lovers. There is graffiti that has lasted down through the ages from the ancient Egyptians. And this is what some people think was written about Hatshepsut and Senenmut. Because we know that there were rumors that they were lovers. And it is pretty fascinating that graffiti lasts that long. So Hatshepsut, she was probably about 50 when she died, 1458. She is known, she was probably a very popular, talented administrator, and her reign was generally peaceful. As I say, there were a couple of uprisings that she had to put down, probably not in person, but the military would take care of that. But for the most part, as I say, it was a peaceful reign. She was not the type who wanted to go conquering new territories, and good for her, because Egypt enjoyed a prosperity that it had longed for some time. Of course, after she died, some years afterwards, for some reason, Thutmose III decided to get rid of her. It was, and again, we're assuming that it's because they did not want a female pharaoh in the roles amongst male pharaohs. It was not right to have a female pharaoh. So her name in many places was erased, and the deeds that were ascribed to her were given either to her father or to Thutmose III. It's interesting that it didn't happen right away. The two of them, as we assume, were probably very close. And it wasn't for another 20 to 25 years that he decided, or maybe was pressured into getting rid of her memory. And they did, fairly thoroughly, but not entirely, of course, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about her. And this is an example of the type of thing that would happen. Kind of strange that they would almost exactly erase the form of her body and leave kind of the outline there. But whenever her name is depicted, oftentimes they don't erase the whole story, they just erase or chisel out her name and put in a different name, like her father. Of course, her name was not entirely wiped out. Many tombs of people who died during her reign mention her, and that they were not going to go back and open up all the tombs of the people who died. And so that was one thing. There were other temples that I think they believed was so sacred that they felt it would be wrong to chisel out her name in certain places. But anyway, only recently have they found or recognized that they have Hatshepsut's mummy. Her tomb was discovered way back in 1902, but it was empty, and there was a nearby tomb with two female bodies there. One of them was Hatshepsut's wet nurse, as labeled, the title was there. Her name was Sitra In, and then there was another body of a female that was anonymous, that they just didn't know who it might be. It wasn't until 2007 that they started examining some other artifacts. One of them was a box in which had her seal, Hatshepsut's seal, on the box, so that they were fairly certain that what was inside was Hatshepsut's. Inside was a liver and a tooth.
Liver?
Her liver, yes. Which was fairly common. When you mummify somebody, you get rid of the guts, you get rid of the brains, and you put them in jars and you set them to the side. Yeah, that's how it goes. That's how you do it. And it just so happens that the tooth matched exactly this mummy that was anonymous with her wet nurse. They also did DNA testing, because we do have her father's mummy, and they matched it up and they said, yes, the two of them are related. So they are almost perfectly certain, as much as you can be in this business, that that mummy is Hatshepsut. And it turns out that she was a rather large woman, not tall, but very overweight, shall we say. She had bone cancer, which may have been what killed her.
Norman Mailer has a novel, I think it's called Ancient Evenings.
I think I've seen that,
And
yeah.
it has a very long description of the mummification process.
Ah, okay.
Hard to read. And when I had him autograph it, he said it was his favorite book.
Really? Yeah. I've seen that. I've been tempted to pick it up. Maybe I will. So here is Hatshepsut. What's left of her? Yeah. Any questions? All right, very good. So next week we have Cleopatra.